All right, class. Today we will look at the progressive era. This topic or this series of lectures will cover the chapters 28 and 29 in your American Pageant book. So what will we cover with these lectures? We will have a brief introduction to progressivism, so you have a good idea of what it was, when it was, and who and what were involved with this movement. The features of progressivism, and then finally we'll look at the progressive presidents, Theodore Roosevelt from his rise to the presidency after William McKinley gets assassinated. William Taft, and then Woodrow Wilson. We'll look at Woodrow Wilson a little bit more as far as foreign policy goes in another lecture series that covers World War One. So looking at the progressive era, this was a reform movement that began in the late 1800s and lasted all the way through the early 1900s. We typically say that the progressive era died with World War One, or America's involvement, I should say, in World War One. The progressive believed that life had gotten so complex that the only way to protect and to fix the ills of society during this time was through government. The government would be the agency for human welfare. We're looking at government at the local, state, and national level. The progressives believed that efficient government could protect public interest and restore order to society. This is a major departure from Jeffersonian America. This is now a belief, or Americans are transitioning to this belief that the federal government had to get more involved. If you remember, Jefferson said everything, should all the power should really rest into the hands of the states. He was looking at that agrarian, the yeoman farmer type America. And even, when we discussed the Gilded Age and we saw all these problems that were sprouting up with urbanization and immigration and labor conflicts, people still had this mentality that the government should not get involved, and, the system or systems should just go ahead and work itself out. I believe it was Grover Cleveland that said that people should support the government, but the government should not support the people. Why did this progressive era or this reform movement happen in the first place? It happened because of some of the problems that the Gilded Age presented to American society. Number one, the gap between rich and poor. I guess I should say a smaller and smaller percentage of Americans were owning more and more of the wealth, and that's when you really started to see in the late 1890s. You started to see this gap really widen between the very, very rich and the very, very poor. This gap between rich and poor had political and economic implications. The wealthy were able to have a lot of political clout and influence over the way or over what policies the government supported, and how the government, acted or responded to certain affairs. If you look at, for instance, some of the strikes, 1877, the Great Railroad Strike, the government stepped in on behalf of management. If you looked at the Haymarket Riot, the Homestead Strike of 1892, the American Railway Strike, or the Pullman Strike of 1894, the government always sided on behalf of business. If you looked at the Sherman Antitrust Act, that was meant to break up these monopolies and trusts, the Supreme Court and the government, didn't really enforce it in the spirit that it was intended to, and in fact, it did more to once again hurt labor than it did to break up monopolies and trusts. The wealthy also, flaunted their wealth in the 1890s when America was experiencing one of the worst depressions that it had ever experienced until the Great Depression of the 1930s. These wealthy New York families were having these huge lavish parties in these hotels, and they would dress up, and it would cost millions of dollars, and they would buy these mansions and these yachts, and they were just almost flaunting their wealth in a time where the average American was really struggling. The workers in America experienced horrible and dangerous working conditions. The living conditions, most Americans and the new immigrants that were coming into America in the late 19th century were living in these in squalor, in the dumbbell tenements that provided very little ventilation or light. The cities had very little sanitation. In fact, I'm going to have to show you during class one of my favorite pictures of this time period, where you have two little kids playing in the sewer during in some American city, and right beside the kids laid a dead horse. And so sanitation was definitely a problem with this rapid urbanization that America was experiencing. And as you saw with your research projects on the Gilded Age, there was little concern for African Americans. Booker T. Washington, he made his strides with the Tuskegee Institute. You will see in the early 20th century W.E.B. Du Bois and the Niagara movement, which will eventually evolve into the NAACP. But as a whole, little concern for African Americans. As you recall, lynchings were on the rise. We had the implementation of Jim Crow laws. We had Plessy versus Ferguson. We have and I guess this is one of the limits of the progressive era, is that the federal government and state and local governments as well, they do very little to address the concerns that the African American community had, and so unfortunately, the African Americans will continue their struggle, their plight for equality, both social equality, economic equality, political equality, you name it. That struggle will continue. So what are the goals of the progressive era? To stop monopolies, to stop political corruption, to stop inefficiency, inefficiency in the government sense, and inefficiency through industry, and social justice. We will see elements of Christianity being brought into the progressive era with the Prohibition movement and with the social gospel movement. How would these progressives be able to do this and to achieve these goals? Once again, through the vehicle of government. I want to stress upon you that idea, or that notion that the federal government, or I should say government in general, has to get more involved to start fixing some of these problems. And also, through government, and we'll talk a bit about this a little bit later. The progressives believe that there needed to be a push for greater democracy, more public participation in politics would mean a push to end some of these problems that America had been experiencing during the Gilded Age. When discussing the road to progressivism, you must talk about the Greenback Party of the 1870s, which will later transition to the Populist Party in 1892. And the program, or the Omaha platform that the Populists had pushed for in 1892, outlined a lot of the reforms that the progressive era would adopt and would later become accomplished in the early 20th century. And a lot of the Populist reformers saw the progressive era as a vindication for the Omaha platform, or for so many of the issues that they championed in the 1890s. In fact, there's a quote here that by a man named William Allen White, and he wrote that populism was, and I quote, was the beginning of a movement that in another decade was to change the politics of the nation. Indeed, it was a symptom of a worldwide drift to liberalism, which reached its peak in Christendom 25 years later, end quote. And so by the 25 years later, he meant that the progressive era reached its peak in 1917 with right before the U.S. entry into World War I. After the collapse of the populist movement with the 1896 election, the reform movement shifted its ideas over to the cities, and how to deal with some of the problems that urbanization had been causing. And this is where the mugwumps come in. The mugwumps were people that brought the notion of good government. They brought that idea to the Progressive Party that, government could be an agent or could be a vehicle for some good, and could be a vehicle to be used for reform. And so you definitely started to see the shift or the road to progressivism as far as how can we use government as an agent to fix some of the problems with the cities. Start with the mugwumps, or these good government types of people. You saw the mugwumps, they were really active as in the Republican Party, and they're actually they used to be called Republican insurgents, because they were bringing in this crazy idea that we could use this the government as an agency for human welfare. So socialism, while most of the progressives, they used a lot of their programs and their agendas and their goals to counter socialist doctrines, socialism still brought to society the ideas that the working conditions, the labor movement, that needed to be addressed, and living conditions of people that were living in these ethnic ghettos, living in the dumbbell tenements, living in these urban slums. Those conditions needed to be addressed as well. And so even though the progressives as a whole found a lot of these socialist doctrines unacceptable and actually sought out to counter some of these doctrines, they still got some of their ideas as far as addressing the labor movement, addressing working conditions, and addressing living conditions from these socialists, which were also, with Eugene Debs, definitely on the rise as far as gaining notoriety and gaining some popularity here, that Eugene Debs will run for president on the Socialist Party platform multiple times, gaining actually in 1920 over 1 million votes in jail, where he was arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Act for protesting or criticizing the draft. Gaining 1 million votes from jail definitely speaks to the popularity, I would think, of either Eugene Debs, the person, the candidate, and there must have been an audience there as far as people that were in tune with some of the socialists, some of the tenets of the socialist agenda. I think in a toss-up between populism, or I guess in a toss-up over what was the most important factor in the road to progressivism, it was either between populism and the social critics. The social critics were important because they used their writing to spur progressive reform against some of these ills of society. Some of the forerunners to the muckrakers, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. Henry DeMarce Lloyd, Wealth Against Commonwealth, a book that struck against the Standard Oil Company of John D. Rockefeller. Thorstein Veblen, The Theory of the Leisure Class, criticized people who made money for seemingly money's sake. And perhaps the most famous or notable, Jacob Riis in 1890 wrote this book called How the Other Half Lives, and in this he used the power of the image or the photograph to expose the living conditions that people were experiencing in these urban slums and in these dumbbell tenements. So he, this whole idea of seeing is believing, and that, maybe actions speak louder than words. Definitely the power of the photograph, or the power of the image to the reader, brought the idea, or addressed the idea that something needs to be done to improve living conditions in these cities. I said the toss-up between the toss-up is between social critics and populism. I say that because even though populism lost in 1896, some of the reforms or some of the platforms or planks on their Omaha platform that would be addressed during the Progressive era, railroad legislation would be passed in 1903 and 1906. The income tax is the 16th Amendment, passed in 1912. There's going to be expanded currency and credit structure with the Federal Reserve System in 1913 and 1916, the direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment passed in 1913, and voting reforms, the initiative, the recall, the secret ballot, the direct primary. These are just to name a few of the voting reforms that the populists had championed in the 1890s that will actually be passed and be used extensively in the 20th century during the Progressive era. So I'll let you be the judge over who was more important, the social critics or the populists.